At that time, Deborah led a life suspended between the dishes she served and the musical notes that she only played inside her own head. She was 25 years old and had been working for almost 2 years as a waitress in an upscale restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. The kind of place where people paid dearly, not only for the food, but also for the sense of superiority that the environment offered. Deborah always arrived early and left very late. Her discreet steps moved through the dining room as, if they were part of the furniture, nobody noticed. She wore a tight bun on the top of her head, her apron always immaculate, and a gaze that disguised her fatigue with a false serenity. On the outside, she was just another invisible employee. On the inside, she carried a suppressed urgency, the urgency to live what she had once dreamed for herself. Before coming to Raleigh, she had lived with her mother and her 2 younger brothers in a small house in the interior of South Carolina. She learned to play the piano at the age of 7 on an old, out-of-tune instrument inherited from the community school. She was one of those children who didn't need sheet music to understand music. It simply flowed from the tips of her fingers, as if it had always been there. But talent, no matter how evident, did not pay the bills. When her father abandoned the family, Deborah was the one who held everything together. She abandoned recitals, cancelled lessons, stored the sheet music in a cardboard box, and came to work in Raleigh. The piano stayed at her mother's house, serving as support for the weekly shopping. And in time, she began to believe that she had made the right choice, until the night everything changed. That specific night, everything seemed to begin like any other. Deborah was in the 3rd hour of her shift and had already memorized the order for each table, as she automatically did to save time and concentration. It was a Wednesday, one of those days when the restaurant was too crowded to be pleasant, but not crowded enough to yield good tips. The ambient sound was the same as always, jazz that was too soft to be truly heard, yet too strong to be ignored. Between trays, Deborah kept her eyes down, as protocol dictated, but her mind had already escaped. She was mentally repeating a passage by Chopin that she used to play when she was a teenager. Sometimes she did this as a secret ritual, almost as if to protect herself from the world, reminding herself that she was still, in some way, an artist, even if nobody there knew, even if nobody cared. It was when Leonard Grayson walked in. Deborah recognized him before even seeing him directly. That type of client who arrived surrounded by an almost theatrical air, with exaggerated steps, artificial laughter, and a scent too strong to be elegant. He was known in town for flaunting everything he could: enormous watches, inflated stories, luxury cars, and, above all, a sick vanity that he masked under the guise of charisma. It was the first time Deborah attended him personally, and his order soon came accompanied by incisive comments. He began by asking, in a tone of mockery, whether the restaurant only hired waitresses or if it was some kind of shelter for failed, aspiring artists. She smiled subtly, as she had learned to do in front of difficult customers, but inside she felt her stomach turn. It wasn't just arrogance. It was as if he saw something she was trying to hide and decided to expose it with pleasure. Deborah continued serving the table as if nothing had happened, but inside, his words echoed. It wasn't just the tone, it was the precision with which he hit where it hurt most. She knew that to an outside observer, she was nothing more than an ordinary waitress. But hearing those words out loud was like being pushed back into the place where the world always wanted to put her. Down, hidden, invisible. Leonard seemed to enjoy his own audacity, playing with the cutlery as if he were performing for an invisible audience. With each new sentence, he threw small barbs, disguised as irrelevant comments, but which carried the clear intention of belittling. It was as if he were bored and had chosen Deborah as a pastime. She tried to remain firm, focused, without giving him room to react. But when she returned to the table for the 3rd time, he decided to go further. He pointed to the piano in the corner of the dining room and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Waitress, I heard you. Play the piano." Why don't you honor us with a performance? Let's see if you really have talent or if you're just a frustrated dreamer." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Not because of the invitation itself, but because of the way it was said, as if it were a challenge, a test, a spectacle of humiliation. Some people laughed. Others simply looked away, as if watching something embarrassing but preferring to pretend they weren't seeing it. Deborah felt her legs go cold. She stood still. For a few seconds, the tray still in her hands, trying to understand if what was happening was real. For an instant, she thought about refusing, about leaving, hiding in the kitchen and waiting for her shift to end. It was safer. It was easier. But there was something different about that night, something she still couldn't explain, a mixture of anger, shame, and accumulated fatigue that began to rise like a knot in her throat. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she no longer wanted to swallow it in silence. She took a deep breath. The dining room suddenly seemed too small, as if all the walls had come closer. Her hands were still trembling a little, but she realized she was too tired to keep quiet any longer. Tired of being just another shadow in the back of the room. Tired of pretending that the talent she carried inside her was worthless simply because the world had never given her a stage. When she looked at the piano, something ignited within her. It wasn't exactly courage. It was an impulse, a force that came from within, a kind of movement that can't be explained, it just happens. She walked silently to the instrument while all eyes turned to her, curious, doubtful, some even malicious. Deborah said nothing. She simply pulled up the stool carefully, adjusted the apron on her lap, and placed her fingers on the keys. For a second, everything stopped. The clatter of cutlery, the whispers, even the ambient sound seemed to quiet down. She hadn't planned to play anything that night. But when she closed her eyes, the first notes came on their own. It was a composition she had created years ago on a rainy afternoon, when she still believed she could make a living from music. It was soft at first, almost timid, as if she were gradually introducing herself. But as her fingers slid over the keys, the music grew, gaining body, strength, intensity. It was as if everything she had kept inside, the pain, the longing, the frustration, the postponed dreams, had finally found a channel to emerge. Each chord seemed to say something she had never had the chance to speak, and even without words, the melody carried an entire message. The room was taken over by an absolute silence, not one of embarrassment, but of admiration. There was something there that nobody expected to hear, and precisely because of that, nobody could look away. The music unfolded in layers, each section with a different texture, as if Deborah was stitching together, right there in front of everyone, pieces of who she had been, of what she had lost, and of what she still dreamed of becoming. Her posture at the piano wasn't one of showmanship, but of surrender. There was no dramatic gesture, no calculated look, just her and the music, and ironically it was precisely that raw truth that captivated the room. The once noisy tables fell silent. Some customers stopped chewing, others set down their cutlery without even noticing. Even the waiters, who rarely allowed themselves a second of pause, stood still in the corners, watching as if they couldn't help themselves. A gentleman at a table in the back discreetly wiped away a tear with his napkin, and a woman at the side tightly held her husband's hand, her eyes fixed on the piano. What was meant to be a spectacle of humiliation was gradually transforming into a rare moment of humanity. And then there was Leonard, seated with his body reclined, his wine glass still half full. He no longer smiled. The sarcasm that had once easily curved at the corner of his mouth gave way to an unmistakable discomfort. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected the waitress to, with a single act of courage, destabilize his air of superiority. He looked around, trying to understand how he had lost control of the situation. And he really had. Deborah, sitting there with her eyes closed, playing, had become greater than any insult he could throw. Her music disarmed, not with anger, not with revenge, but with beauty, And that was the most painful part for him, because nobody knew the name of the composition, but everyone knew what it meant. And at that moment, everyone in the restaurant, even if unconsciously, knew they were witnessing something that didn't happen every day. When she finished playing, Deborah kept her hands resting on the keys for a few more seconds. Not because she wanted applause. In fact, she wasn't thinking about that at all. It was as if she was still returning from a distant place, a space known only to her, where her essence was still intact. She slowly opened her eyes and only then realized what had happened. The entire dining room was on its feet. The sound of applause filled the space like a wave coming from all corners at once. But it wasn't a formal applause, the kind given out of courtesy. It was an emotional, genuine applause, the kind that bursts forth when something touches you deep inside, and the only possible response is to clap endlessly. Deborah looked around, confused, almost disconcerted. She wasn't used to being seen, much less celebrated. For a moment, she even thought about running back to the kitchen and disappearing into anonymity. But something inside her said she shouldn't. That moment wasn't just a beautiful accident, it was a turning point, a breakthrough. When she returned to the counter, still with slightly teary eyes, she was greeted with warm hugs from colleagues who had barely exchanged words with her before. "Why did you never mention that you played like that?" asked one of the waitresses, with a smile as if she had just discovered a precious secret. The manager, always serious and distant, also approached, visibly moved. "You just transformed the night of this restaurant," he said, unable to hide his pride. Deborah just nodded, still processing everything. Leonard, for his part, paid the bill in silence. He left without drawing attention, with his head bowed, defeated not by humiliation, but by the greatness he had not anticipated. That night, which began as yet another attempt to belittle her, ended with the elevation of everything Deborah truly was, even if she was still getting used to the idea of being recognized. When she left the restaurant that night, the air seemed different. It was the same biting cold, typical of March nights in Raleigh, but there was something new in the way Deborah walked. It wasn't a grand change, one that you'd notice from afar. It was subtle. It was in the less hunched step, in the lighter look in her eyes, in the fact that she hadn't put on her headphones immediately as she left, as she did every day to drown out her own thoughts. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to listen to what the world was saying. There was something pulsating inside her, a kind of life that had been dormant, but that night had awakened in a way that could no longer be ignored. She walked slowly to the bus stop, her hands still cold from the keys and her heart strangely offbeat. And yet it felt good, scary but good. The next day, the restaurant felt different. Deborah arrived early, as usual, but was greeted with different looks. There was no longer that filter of invisibility that used to surround her. Customers greeted her, some asking to see the pianist from last night, and even the cooks, who always operated on autopilot, began to treat her with more care. But what she didn't expect was what happened at the end of the shift. A man approached her, wearing a simple coat and an attentive look. He said that he had dined there the previous night, seated at one of the tables at the back. "The music stayed in my head all day," he said. "I'm a music producer, and I have a small studio here in town, and if you want, I'd like to record a demo with you." Deborah froze. It was as if the world had turned a corner, and something new was emerging on the other side. It wasn't a contract yet, it wasn't fame, it wasn't any guarantee, but it was a beginning, a real beginning. She didn't know what to say immediately. She stood there, holding her purse with both hands, trying to understand if what was happening was real or just another twist of fate. The producer, who introduced himself as Mark Ellis, didn't insist. He just left his card, a simple piece of paper with small letters, and said, "You decide." But it would be a waste to let that talent be confined only to casual nights. Deborah thanked him, still unsure how to react, and left. On the way home, she looked at the card about 10 times. It was as if that piece of paper weighed more than everything she carried. On one hand, she felt fear. The familiar fear of being frustrated again, of believing in something and getting hurt. On the other, there was a spark lit inside her, that same spark she felt when she was a child, secretly playing the school piano. One part of her wanted to protect herself, the other wanted to chase after what had always been hers. In the days that followed, Deborah tried to maintain her routine. She continued going to work, serving tables, smiling at customers, trying to convince herself that it had all been just an unusual night. But something no longer fit in the same place. The feeling of playing in front of everyone, of being heard, of seeing herself again as an artist, had changed something fundamental. She began to go home and play on the old keyboard she had bought used months before, without grand pretensions. For the first time in a long while, she sat there not as a pastime, but as a return, a reunion. She started composing again, rescuing old songs, creating new melodies. Music, which had once been only a pleasant and distant memory, was now becoming part of the present, and perhaps the future. 2 days later, she gathered her courage and called Mark. Her voice came out trembling, with that tone of someone not yet sure if they were doing the right thing. He answered kindly, as if he had been waiting for that call. They arranged to meet over the weekend at his small studio, located at the back of an independent bookstore in a quiet neighborhood in town. When Deborah arrived there, she felt that old flutter in her stomach that used to come before her teenage recitals. The studio was modest, with walls lined with acoustic foam, a few worn chairs, and a vertical piano in the corner, newer than any she had ever played. Mark listened to some of her compositions in silence, jotting down notes in a notebook, without interrupting her. At the end of the session, he simply said, "You have your own signature. That's what differentiates someone who just plays well from someone who has something to say. You have something to say." Those words resonated in her for days. You have something to say. It was a simple phrase, but it had layers. It was no longer about playing well or impressing someone. It was about recognizing yourself, validating yourself, allowing yourself to exist as an artist, even without stages, without fame, without spotlights, just for the right to express what you feel. The demo recording took place over 2 weeks. Gradually, Deborah began to leave her shyness aside and surrender to the process. It was strange and beautiful at the same time to listen to herself through headphones, to recognize her flaws, her nuances, her strengths. The studio became a second refuge, almost an extension of herself. When she finished the last take of the final track, she sat there for a few minutes looking at the keyboard, thinking about everything she had experienced up to that point, and for the first time in a long while, she felt that something inside her was in the right place. The demo recording didn't make newspaper headlines, nor did it attract crowds. But that was never the point. What really changed was the way Deborah began to see herself. She didn't leave her job at the restaurant. She still needed the paycheck at the end of the month. But she no longer served tables with the same weight on her shoulders. She knew that it was only a piece of her story, not its end. Gradually, she began to play on the restaurant's piano during breaks, with the manager's permission, who realized how much it benefited not only her, but the atmosphere itself. Customers began coming not only for the food, but also for the music. And, without her even noticing, her name started circulating among local artist groups, small cafes, cultural events. Nothing glamorous, nothing spectacular, but everything deeply real. One night, an elderly lady approached Deborah as she was putting away her apron after her shift. She said that she came to the restaurant every week just to listen to her melodies. "There's something in your music that soothes my soul," she said with a trembling voice, her eyes brimming. It was that kind of thing that now made sense to Deborah. It wasn't about recognition on a grand scale. It was about touching someone, making them feel, giving form to the invisible. Sometimes she still felt insecure, as if she were treading on fragile ground, liable to crumble at any moment. But whenever fear appeared, she remembered that night. The night when, even unwillingly, she was put in front of everyone and chose not to lower her head. The night when she transformed humiliation into art, silence into sound, fear into movement. It was that memory that anchored her, and it was that which made every new step possible. Over time, new opportunities began to emerge. A small local cafe invited Deborah to play live on Friday nights. It was a cozy space with low light, local artists' paintings on the walls, and a loyal clientele that valued atmosphere over luxury. The first time she performed there, she felt her hands sweat as if it were her debut in life. But one note was enough for everything to align. The music found room to breathe there, and so did she. The audience was different from that at the restaurant. People didn't come to dine and hear music by chance. They came for the music. People who closed their eyes as she played, who greeted her at the end of the performance with sincere words, who asked to know the names of the compositions. And so, slowly, without fanfare, Deborah began to claim the place that had always been hers, but which had been denied to her for so long. At home, the change was also visible. Her mother, who used to be worried about her daughter's path, began to support her more confidently. "You are doing what you always should have done, my dear," she said once, while holding a CD of the newly finished demo. Her brothers, now teenagers, started seeing her with different eyes, not only as the eldest sister who held everything together, but as someone who had the courage to be who she was, despite everything. The old little box with sheet music, forgotten in a corner of the closet, returned to the shelf. The songs began to fill the house, and the old childhood piano, now refurbished with the help of a family friend, reclaimed its place in the living room. Art, which had once been just a silent remnant of who Deborah was on the inside, became a visible part of her life. And that changed everything. One day, while organizing some loose papers in the studio, Deborah found an old note she had written years ago. "Don't let your whole life pass without at least trying." It was a simple, almost childish phrase, but now it carried a different weight. She smiled to herself upon reading it, remembering the little girl who had written those words in a school notebook between math classes. That little girl still existed inside her, dreamy, stubborn, passionate about music, but now with scars, experiences, and choices that made her stronger. Not perfect, not confident all the time, but real. And perhaps that was what made her art so intense, because every note she played came from a true place. It wasn't about impeccable technique or huge stages. It was about presence, about saying, "I am here," even when the whole world tries to say otherwise. One night, already accustomed to the cafe's performance ritual, Deborah recognized a familiar face in the audience. It was one of the restaurant's customers from the time when she was just the unnoticed waitress among the tables. The woman approached her after the show, saying that she remembered that night at the piano and that she had never forgotten the way she felt listening to that music. "It was the first time I saw someone transform embarrassment into beauty, and that touched me," she said sincerely, eyes glistening. Deborah thanked her with a calm smile, feeling that somehow everything connected. Life, even when it seems determined to push you down, always leaves a crack through which courage can enter. And it was through that crack that she passed, not as someone who intrudes, but as someone who finally returns to her rightful place. Today, when she looks back, Deborah still gets emotional remembering that night in the restaurant, not because of the humiliation, nor because of the challenge itself, but because of what that moment revealed about herself. It was there, in a space that tried to silence her, that she rediscovered her voice. Not a voice of protest or revenge, but a voice made of notes, pauses, and melodies that said everything the words couldn't. That performance was a turning point, not because it changed the world around her, but because it made her finally see her own worth. And that, no one could ever take away. Neither Leonard Grayson, nor fear, nor the exhausting routine. She understood that the world might try to shape us, silence us, trap us in roles. But there comes a point when the inner truth shouts louder. And when that happens, there is no turning back. Deborah still lives a simple life without major spotlights or magazine covers, but now she lives with purpose. She plays at small events, gives piano lessons to children, and continues composing in her own time. The demo, recorded with Mark, became an independent EP, discreetly released online, but which reached people on the other side of the country. People who wrote saying how much her songs had helped them in difficult moments. And that, for her, was worth more than any fame. Sometimes she still questions herself, still feels insecure, still fears tomorrow, like anyone else. But she never again allowed doubt to define her steps, because she understood, with the strength of someone who had crossed her own shadow, that greatness is not about being applauded by everyone. It's about having the courage not to hide from yourself. And it was thus, in the silence of an ordinary night, that Deborah became who she always was once again. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel, give it a thumbs up, and turn on notifications.